Our next subject is cardiac blocks. You may know them as heart blocks. You need to know them to take care of cardiac patients, to look at an electrocardiography waveform and understand how to detect them, and of course how to treat them. And all these things are also needed not only in real life, but for the NBRC exam. So let's check out heart blocks. So what is a heart block? To understand that, we must understand why the heart beats. And that's because of electrical signals that are flowing through the heart. When we take a look at those electrical signals, we can look at the heart from two different perspectives. We can look at the electrical aspect of the heart, that electrical system, but we can also look at the mechanical beating of the heart. Those two things are very, very different, but they are associated. The study of the electrical system in the heart you might know already as electrocardiography. You might refer to that more commonly as an ECG or even more commonly as an EKG. We can look at a tracing on a graph and we can understand and monitor and see how well electricity is flowing through the muscles and the pathways of the heart. But the other thing we can look at is also the mechanical aspect of the heart, and this is where we study how well the heart is beating. It's basically just looking at how effective the actual physical contractions are. So let's connect the electrical and the mechanical systems of the heart. When electricity travels down the pathways of the heart, it travels to what we call nodes. These nodes are like little on and off switches that when the electricity touches them, it triggers a contraction of the physical aspect of the heart. The actual muscle begins to contract. Well, it turns out that as we look at these electrical signals, the amount of time that it takes to get from one node to the other or from one part of the heart to the other is a time that we can track on the ECG waveform, and that time is fairly predictable. In a normal heart, we know about how much time it should take to get from one part of the heart to the other or from one node to the other. However, in a diseased heart or a heart with excessive muscle tissue or diseased muscle tissue or basically just anything wrong with the muscle tissue at all, then that time that it takes to get from one part of the heart to the other or one node to the other is prolonged. And we can detect that prolonging period of time on the ECG waveform. Now here's what I mean by that. As you know, when you look at an ECG waveform, you see all these little bumps. And if you'll take a closer peek at this one, you'll see that this little teeny tiny bump, which is known as the P wave, this is where electricity originates from what we call the sinoatrial node, which is sitting at the top of the right atrium. This SA node generates electricity and begins to send it across the atria to what's called the AV node, or the atrioventricular node, and eventually subsequent contraction of the ventricles. But as it travels from the SA node to get to the AV node, it crosses over the muscular areas of the atria and it causes its contraction, and that contraction shows up out as a P wave. Now I say contraction, just because there's a P wave doesn't actually prove that the heart actually responded to the electrical signal. The contraction may not have happened. That's something we'll talk about later as pulseless electrical activity. And that's when the electricity can flow through the heart and all the bumps are there and they look great, but the heart is sitting there like a rock, not doing anything. But generally in most people's heart, when the SA node fires and it travels to the AV node, then we are going to see 99.9% of the time, we are going to see a contraction of the atria. Now, once it hits the AV node, this is where it starts to travel down a couple of different branches that each go to the right and the left ventricles, and this is what precipitates the contraction of the ventricles. On the ECG waveform, this is known as the QRS complex. It's that big spike. This is where the heart is really, really beating. It's the big ventricles, those are big muscles, and so it shows up as that large spike in the QRS complex. And then, of course, just for fun, I'll talk about this after the QRS complex. We have a little bit of a T wave. We don't talk about that a lot. That's not associated with contraction, but rather repolarization of the heart. It's when we reset the heart and get it ready for the next contraction. One thing to note here is that as the AV node receives the signal from the SA node, right after the atria have contracted, just a little bit of time goes by. You'll see this time between the P wave and the QRS complex. We're going to talk about that more because that's going to be important whenever there's a heart block. But one thing I'll say is that what we look at is the distance between these waves. So when the distance between the P wave and the QRS complex gets bigger, we're concerned. That's because the electrical impulse ventricles is taking a little bit too much time to get to the AV node and cause the ventricles to contract. So we'll come back to that as we look at heart blocks, but the time in between the waves is of paramount importance to us, especially the time between the P wave, where the atria contract, and the QRS complex, where the ventricles contract. Well, now that we understand how the electricity flows through the heart and how it causes contraction, we're ready to look at heart blocks. So what is a heart block? Well, there's three types. There's first degree, second degree, and a third degree heart block. And what is a block? Well, it's just an impedance of the flow of electricity through the heart. And of course, that would result in some sort of problem with a contraction. So when you have a heart block, yes, it's going to take more time for the electricity to get from one bump to the other on the ECG waveform. So it's going to result in a delayed contraction, but it could also result in a missing contraction altogether. And that's why we get concerned about heart blocks. If the electricity is impeded, not only will it take time, causes some discoordination in the heart, it could actually result in the heart not beating properly, and that means blood's not moving. And the degree of heart block is a degree of severity. So that's why we want to take a look at the first, second, and third degree blocks. Now, admittedly, this area is a little bit nerdy, so just as we have to do sometime, make sure you go get your nerd glasses so we can study first, second, and third degree heart blocks. Let's take a peek.